So I would like to take off from your book title, "The Great Powers Are Back." And when do you think we realize in post-Cold War era that we're turning back to get back to the great scene?
I think the moment at which it was absolutely unmistakable was February 2022 with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But I think the process of adjustment to this new great power world probably for most people began in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. I would say a few very observant people could already see it from about 2005, 2007, when you had the first signs of resurgent Russian revanchism. You had Putin's notorious speech to the Munich Security Conference. And of course, you had the rise of China and the looming confrontation in East Asia. But I would say really from 2022 is the moment at which we're definitively back in a great power age.
But you're taking from Russia, right? When Putin began to return all those speeches about the great power, about the glory of post-Second World War. So it's Russia which first pushed the button.
I would say as far as Europe is concerned, yes. As far as the rest of the world is concerned, perhaps one might say, as I mentioned earlier, the rise of the Sino-American confrontation. You might say perhaps the US national security strategy of 2017, which actually defined the new challenges facing the US as ones of great power issues rather than terrorism and complex emergencies. So one can predate it, but it becomes absolutely clear from February 2022. That's my main point.
After Cold War, many people in the West believed that economics and globalization replaced everything, the old school power politics, but geopolitics never went away. So actually it was always with us behind the scenes, despite we were going to the economical side, trading, cooperation, and so on.
Yes, there was this expectation that everything was converging on a form of liberal modernity, that we would be living in a rules-based international order, that the economies would globalize, that really the main issues were transnational rather than interstate. And as you say, geopolitics never went entirely away. Certainly if you look at East Asia, you look at the issue of North Korea, which was always there, even during the high point of globalization and expectations of the retreat of great power politics. North Korea was still a threat. If you think of the crises in the mid-1990s, for example, you had, even in Europe, you had the wars in Yugoslavia, which had substantial great power input, but was essentially a conflict generated from within the boundaries of the former Yugoslavia. You had, of course, the Middle East, where you had the Iraq invasion. But I would say, if you look at Europe as a whole, which is our main reference point here, there was, I think, a real sense after the fall of the wall, after the end of the Cold War, after the new surge in European integration, I think there was a widespread belief that great power politics was something we'd put behind us. Now that, of course, was a Eurocentric viewpoint, but it was very widely held on our continent.
Exactly. So I'd like to continue with Europe question, because eventually Europe is not a great power. You're considering nowadays to be a great power. So what does it mean for Europe, and particularly for Baltic countries, speaking about those great powers which you mentioned are back?
So the reason why I argue that Europe is not a great power is because Europe does not exist as a state. It doesn't. You could say the European Union has a very large regulatory and economic reach. That's unquestionable. And that reach is not just on the continent of Europe, where it's absolutely dominant. That reach is also global. But the European Union is not a great power because it doesn't have its own foreign policy, it doesn't have its own army, it doesn't have its own nuclear deterrent, it doesn't have any of those characteristics, apart from the economic strength, that you would expect of a great power. Now, to answer your question about what all this means, particularly for the Baltic states, of course, it makes the position of the three Baltic states, but also of the wider Baltic Sea region, I mean, including certainly Finland and Sweden, to a certain extent Denmark, definitely Poland, very precarious, because the expectation that we had prior to, let us say, 2005, 2007, that Russia was on a liberalizing, essentially Western trajectory. That assumption, of course, has progressively collapsed and was comprehensively buried by the events of February 2022. And so now the question is, what is the position of the three Baltic states in this era of new great power conflict? They are plainly threatened by Moscow. Can they rely on Washington? Can they rely on Brussels? Can they rely on London? And so the Baltic states need to find within those wider European structures, be that the European Union or be that, in military terms, NATO, the backstop or the reserve force they need to survive in this new great power world.
So how you would answer this question? Can we rely?
I would say that you can absolutely rely on London, that the commitment given through the NATO alliance is one that Britain intends to honour. You can ask a legitimate question about whether the UK at this moment, right now, is doing enough to give itself the means to honour that commitment. That's a separate question. But there's no doubt about the political and strategic belief in the importance of the alliance and of holding Russia as far east as possible. There's no question about that. And it also rests on a very strong public consensus, for now at any rate, in the UK. It's different when it comes to the United States, as I'm sure you know.
It's dynamic.
It's a much more dynamic situation. And I would say it's also a very complex one, because while it is true that President Trump has, in very important respects, damaged the brand of NATO through the question mark he's put over the Article 5 commitment, lots of comments he's made about the Ukraine war, where he has, to my mind, completely unjustifiably played down Russian aggression. All of that is not in question. On the other hand, he has also hugely increased the investment in NATO. Sadly, although the Americans had asked politely for decades for the Europeans to increase their investment, they had largely failed to do so. Now President Trump, who is in many respects, as we know, a very problematic figure, but through his approach has forced the Europeans to do that. Now, how do you balance those two things? You know, he damages the brand, he increases the investment. What does that do to the NATO share price? And we simply don't know. We do not know how Russian planners are factoring this in, because the capabilities they are now facing are larger than they were a few years ago. But the political intent behind them is more in doubt. So it's an interesting conundrum.
We'll speak about Britain a little bit later. I have a few questions about Britain as a great power again, but now I'd like to stop with Russia, and more precisely threat of Russia. Makes us forecast its action and policy, especially when powers within itself compete actually, and we see that Russia turning closely towards China, but President Trump is speaking to Mr. Putin too, with, well, let's say, respect and as an equal companion. So how do you think this inside competition and dialogue between power, where can it lead us in nearest perspective?
Well, President Trump's intent and hope is to peel Russia off from the People's Republic of China. He sees China as the main rival of the United States. He sees the world largely in terms of great power antagonisms, rather than as a conflict, say, between two orders, which would be my preferred lens. In other words, the struggle between a Western democratic order and an Eastern authoritarian order, of whom the two poles would be Russia and the PRC. President Trump believes that actually that's the wrong way of looking at it, and that therefore the imperative, rather than rallying the West against the authoritarian powers, he actually thinks he can split the authoritarian powers. Now, that's not a completely stupid aspiration. It's been done before. If you think of the Nixon opening to China, for example, in the early 1970s. One can think of other instances from history where that kind of operation has been executed more or less successfully. The difficulty, I think, is that in the present circumstances, there is really very little incentive for Putin to break with the PRC, because the main threat he faces is actually political from Europe, from the threat that Ukraine may be a success and other challenges. So I don't see Trump's strategy here succeeding in the short term. The other factor is that the Sino-Soviet split by quite a period predated the opening between Washington and Beijing. And I don't see any signs at the moment of a split between Moscow and Beijing, which would have to predate, I think, the rapprochement between Moscow and Washington.
Yeah, Moscow and Beijing is a very interesting question because it's sort of cooperation, sort of competition, because Russia might see a threat from Far East, how China integrates gradually in Siberia, let's say. So it's also not the complete cooperation. It's quite precautious sight into each other, right?
I think that's true. And of course, there had been very severe tensions in the last century. If you think of the confrontations along the Ussuri River in 1969, if you think of the proxy rivalry in Indochina, for instance, and one can think of other examples, that's absolutely true. And the idea of a threat from China to Russia's Far East has been a constant in Russian politics and culture. So Putin himself, about 20 years ago, ruminated when he visited the Far East of Russia, visiting one of the frontier towns. And he could see even then, of course, since then it's become much more extreme, he could see even then that the Chinese side was more developed. And he contrasted the bright lights on the Chinese side with the decrepitude on the Russian. And he publicly reflected, he asked himself, what language will they be speaking on the Russian side in 20, 25 years' time? And his expectation obviously was that they would be speaking Chinese and that China would continue to expand culturally and economically into Russia. So that's definitely a concern. It's also true that, in Russian culture and literature, there is anxiety about this Chinese penetration. If you think of Sorokin's Day of the Oprichnik, for example, it's a satire, but it's very much also plays on this idea of Chinese goods, Chinese cars, really taking over the Russian market. And
which was very important 25 years ago when the economical situation was very uneven in Russia.
Exactly.
And we had straw of help for that regions.
Yes. So all of that is there. Nevertheless, at the moment, given the overriding threat from the West, perceived on both sides, they both need each other so much that I don't really see much opportunity for President Trump to drive a wedge between them. But he's determined to do so. And he may succeed, but it seems to me unlikely.
Remaining with China, what power politics China is setting at the moment, do you think? And can China, let's say, replace the order of US in some sort of scenario?
Well, it's possible. It depends on many different factors. It depends on whether China can maintain its economic position, which at the moment is questionable. It depends a little bit on whether it can exploit its advantage in, for example, electric vehicles and to lean into the green transformation, which definitely strengthens it vis-a-vis, for example, Europe. It will depend on whether it makes wise decisions on Taiwan, whether it takes the view that it is winning and therefore perhaps adopts an attentist position, that it doesn't need to do anything very radical. It would depend on the behavior of Taiwan. So if Taiwan were to declare independence, and this might be understood as, inverted commas, a provocation, this might precipitate Chinese action. It would depend on what happens in Russia. If Russia goes down, is seen to be defeated, then that will damage the PRC. So there are an awful lot of imponderables I don't think there's anything really in our present situation or trends that would suggest that the PRC will inevitably overtake the United States. I don't think that's the case. I think it's much more in the balance.
And in economics, probably, in European side, that we will feel the impact of China more and more and more, especially speaking about the green vehicles and what you just mentioned on the European side. Let's get back to Europe and Ukraine, NATO, EU tensions. What historical parallels are concerning you most in this scenario, which you already described briefly, but speaking about history and this situation, which parallels you think is most dangerous?
Well, of course, I speak as an historian, but I also speak from a particular standpoint. So I'm not a neutral observer in that sense. I am a strong supporter of Ukraine. I would like Ukraine to win the war, or at the very least to be put in a position to achieve some kind of compromise so that it can survive as an independent state. I think that Ukraine is already and potentially can be an even greater ally to the West. So when I express my concern and I look for parallels in the past, I suppose one parallel that has crossed my radar is that of Finland of 1939-1940, which as a narrative is on the one hand inspiring because you've got the Finnish resistance, the unexpected defeats inflicted on Stalin's Soviet Union in 1939, but ultimate and quite a lot of support, or a reasonable amount of support, sent from the Nordic states and some from Britain and France. But in the end, of course, numbers told, the Finns were ground down, and Finland was not, of course, overrun, and then it managed to survive again after having reopened hostilities during the Second World War, but it was effectively neutralized. And although the situation is not in every respect analogous, because Ukraine is a much bigger country with bigger reserves, and of course is being, although inadequately, nevertheless quite extensively supported by the West. So there's no direct comparison. But it's not hard to imagine a situation where Ukraine quite soon or not too long down the road takes the view that this war is unsustainable, that we in the West are not doing enough to help them, and thereby concludes a peace or a truce, if you prefer, which is similar to that agreed by the Finns, which would then leave them an independent state with considerable autonomy, but effectively would neutralize them and take them out of the Western system.
It's some territorial amendments.
That too. Yeah. But to me, and I, it's easy for me to say this, I'm not Ukrainian, I'm not talking about my own territory, but it would appear to me at any rate, and I think this may also be true for quite a lot of Ukrainians, that the issue of the territory, while really, really important and obviously highly symbolic because of the many lives lost defending that territory, is not in the end the critical point. The really decisive point is that whatever emerges as the state of Ukraine should be fully independent and able to integrate into the West. And I say that not just because I wish with all my heart for Ukraine that it would have that possibility. I also think it's very important for us. I can't think of anything less satisfactory for the West, for Europe, to have a Ukraine which is neutralized, which is taken out of the Western system, because they are now, in many respects, our greatest allies. If you think of the huge military potential and innovation and resilience within Ukraine, we would want to have that on our side. So, therefore, I think the Finnish, you asked me for historical examples that concern me, it would be a repeat of that Finnish scenario.
We mention from time to time in talks, interviews, Munich from '38, and it reminds us a little bit the US policy of peace. When you're trying to give somebody, the aggressor, what he wants, and then to expect that everything will settle down after that.
Yes, there are elements of Munich in what Trump is intending. There are also, as I said earlier, elements of the Nixonian initiative of the early 70s. So there are different elements from different parallels. I don't see the Munich analogy quite as sharply as you do, simply because although I regard Putin as a terrible dictator and as a menace to Europe's integrity, I don't for now see him as having quite the same level of ambition as Adolf Hitler had. But there are definite parallels, I would say more broadly, in terms of the narrative that both Hitler and Putin entertain. In other words, this sense of being excluded from the West, the sense of being dominated by, particularly by the Anglo-Saxons, of being exploited, of being colonized. I've conducted these comparisons before. It's very striking how similar that rhetoric is. And so you have to put yourself in the position of somebody like Putin, who of course does not see himself as an aggressor. He sees himself as resisting the encroaching tide of the West. And he believes that the only way that he can prevent himself from being colonized is himself to act in an imperialist way, which, by the way, was also Hitler's conception. Now, we don't need to agree with that. In fact, we must radically reject that notion. But I do think it's important as historians to understand where they're coming from.
Well, Putin is another dictator who is highly concerned about Anglo-Saxon powers, well, according to your studies and your books. Yes. But anyway, let's speak about another great power, formerly great power, which, according to you, had a decisive role in European history, and it's Germany. And what's role of Germany nowadays, especially when we see that Germany economically is not in the most flourishing times, and in terms of military might and in terms of the role in the international politics. So what's the role of Germany nowadays?
Well, Germany is developing simultaneously, as it were, in two slightly contradictory directions, because as you say, economically, it's not doing well, and certainly by comparison with, the Germany of the 1980s and 70s, but also the Germany of the high points of the Merkel years, not so long ago, it is doing far worse. On the other hand, in military terms, it is doing far more than it has been certainly since the end of the Cold War.
At last.
Which is, one would say at last, and not before time. It has also undergone, if you like, a kind of strategic revolution, a revolution of strategic consciousness. So the old principles of Wandel durch Handel, of change through trade, those really have now been abandoned. And so the whole idea of Nord Stream, which you're familiar with, the idea of trading with Russia and being dependent on Russia for energy, that has also gone. There has been a new understanding of the importance of strategy and of the great powers. So you have your first national security strategy in Germany. For a long time, they refused to have any document that had the words, those words on it, because they considered that a bad thing. So all of that is changing, and I think is generally for the good. The difficulty really is that for understandable historical reasons, Germany is shy of acting as a great power. It's not, for example, a nuclear power. And I think that really Germany needs to make a decision. It has hitherto hidden its own role, but also has hidden behind the European Union. So it hides within the European Union, but also hides behind the European Union. And it really needs to decide in its own mind, does it want the European Union to be the great power actor, in which case it needs to help bring about the transformation of the European Union into a single union state capable of exercising that great power role, or it does not want to do that, either because it doesn't want to or because it thinks it's not possible because the other Europeans will not collaborate, in which case Germany itself needs to become a great power with everything that involves. But I think persisting with this current neither the one nor the other, I think that's no longer sustainable in the world of Vladimir Putin and of Donald Trump.
But anyway, if I understand you correctly, so we need German leadership in the European Union. So Germany should take the leadership role.
I think within the European Union, Germany is the largest power, the largest potential, and also the one certainly has more incentive than France to address the question of Russia. And so it needs to either take the initiative itself, or it needs to create the European structures, which would then mean that whatever policy there was not the policy of one country, but simply the policy of the Union. At the moment, it is doing neither. I mean, it's not doing too badly compared to before, but it's not doing enough.
We mentioned France. It's a great question about the role of France, because, well, between Germany and Britain, France was always a very important player against or doing things and developing European Union. So do you think France is a leader of European Union, or it can take some certain leadership together with Germany?
Well, France, and in particular President Macron, certainly sees itself or himself as the leader of Europe.
Rhetorically.
Rhetorically, but in their own minds also practically. And of course, in the narratival terms, they have talked a lot about European sovereignty and about increasing the role of Europe. But in the end, this is generally just tended to be the maximization of French power through the structures of the European Union. There's never really been in France a willingness to embark on a European project on the supranational level. So if you think, for example, the European Defence Community, which was the idea of creating a European army in effect in the 1950s, that was defeated by the French National Assembly. And at every stage, really, France has been more intergovernmental than supranational. And even though President Macron, in a sense, has moved a bit beyond that, he still has not really come forward with any concrete proposals for the creation of a true union, which would mean the end of the national states in Europe. Having said that, France is a very, very important actor. I don't myself classify it as a great power, because it has lost important aspects of its sovereignty, for example, the currency, control over its own border. These have now been uploaded into the European Union. However, it is also true that France has got a serious conventional capability, and more particularly, a nuclear capability which is entirely independent, unlike that of the UK, for example. And in the present climate, that could be quite important. So I think the role of France cannot at all be discounted, but I don't see it as one of the great powers at the moment.
And of course, the threat of new election, every time that the right powers can come and become even more nationalistic, so turning from the European values and all the common
But that,
politics.
of course, we may not like whatever happens within France, but just the election of a Rassemblement president would not in and of itself mean that France ceased to be an important actor. We might like less what it does, but it would still be an important actor.
We have to touch Britain question, because you already said that Britain is present and a supporting country, a highly supporting country. But anyway, how do you think the role of Britain will develop in the nearest future?
Well, I think, and this is of course a very overused phrase, inflection point, but I do think we really are at a crossroads in the UK. On the jacket cover of the British edition of my Great Powers book, I've got 4 flags: the Chinese flag, or the PRC's flag, the American flag, the Russian flag, and the UK Union flag. And while the PRC flag and the American, the Star Spangled Banner, are both complete and undamaged, the Union flag, the UK Union flag, and the Russian flag are somewhat fraying, visibly fraying at the sides. And I chose that image because I wanted to suggest that while both Russia and Britain were great powers, in my view, they were definitely great powers that were under severe challenge. And I think that the difficulty faced by the UK today is simply a question of investment. I think the UK has actually fallen back from 2022 and 2023, when I began writing the book, in fact, and today. I'd be interested in your view on this, whether that is also the perception in the Baltic Sea region. But the UK has by comparison with other powers, you mentioned Germany earlier on, but also Poland, for example, which has massively increased its investment. The UK, having been one of the highest spenders historically, is now far less obviously a leader. And the question would be, will that remain the case? If that were to remain the case over the next 10 years or so, then I think it would be no longer possible to regard the UK as a leader. If, on the other hand, and as a great power, if, on the other hand, there is a turn towards greater investment, which has been signalled by the Starmer administration. So I think intellectually this is well understood, but they just haven't done it. But if it does happen, then I think the UK's role will be absolutely reinforced.
Curious enough, but from those four flags, I think historically only Union flag has no stars. Because the Russian flag before the 90s had a star, Chinese and the US flag, so only Great Britain.
Interesting point.
Yeah, sorry. Anyway, great power and the post-colonial complex, or everything which is connected to the former colonial country. Is it a contradiction in Britain?
I don't think so. You quite often hear the argument that talk of Britain as a great power or global Britain is somehow, Empire 2.0 or post-imperial nostalgia, that perhaps the turn away from Europe is, a belief in some kind of British Empire identity, which is long overcome. I don't believe that to be the case. And I think here historical perspective is quite important. So first England and then Great Britain from 1707 were important even before the British Empire reached its full extent. So, you could say, while it is obviously true that the empire reinforced Britain's position in Europe, and actually that was one of the main reasons for having the empire, it's also the case that Britain only achieved the empire because it was important in Europe. And so I think one can uncouple the idea of Britain's great powerlessness from the empire itself. And I think the global Britain harks back much more to an earlier idea of, sort of adventurers, commercial activity, and engagement with the world, rather than territorial imperialism, which was relatively late in the day, and in the end somewhat short-lived. And what's striking to me is how much interest there is in other parts of the world in British power. If you look at Japan, for example, it has greatly increased its relationship with the UK. If you think of the Hiroshima Accords, you think of the emphasis Japan places on the visits from the carrier group every 2 years and so on. If you think of Britain's position in the Falkland Islands, if you think of the aggravation caused by the failure of the UK to defend Cyprus in the first instance. Of course, now it is defending it, but there was a moment when that looked problematic. And the initial situation in the Gulf, these were territories which had a legitimate expectation of Britain discharging a role, which it for a while failed to do. But that seems to me more to reflect an assumption that Britain is important rather than that it is unimportant.
For the very end of our conversation, I would like to get back to Baltic region and Britain had a very important role after First World War, 1919, when it was one of the first states from allies to recognize Lithuania de facto. Anyway, what's the view in British government in very high level, the true view, let's say, to the Baltic region, and what's really known about this region in that part of politics in Britain?
So historically, as you imply, the role of the UK has been, at certain points, absolutely decisive. So the first independence of the three Baltic states was certainly, in a diplomatic sense, superintended by Britain. It was also, in a military sense, facilitated by the dispatch of the Royal Navy, which helped to keep the Bolsheviks, and to a certain extent also the German Free Corps, at bay. And Britain also, mediated border disputes and that kind of thing. But during that period, we're talking now the interwar period, that is to say between the First and Second World Wars, the first interwar period, if you like, Britain was important to the region, but the region was not necessarily that important to Britain. And that's where I would see the difference between then and now. Britain is still pretty important within the region, I would argue, not only because of its commitment to deterrence with the deployment in Estonia, but principally actually through the leadership of the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which of course knits together all the Baltic Sea region countries plus Iceland, and is led, and the Netherlands, and is led by Britain. And particularly in the light of, doubts over the American role, is politically and increasingly militarily very important. So that commitment to the region is there. And I think that, to answer your question about the levels of knowledge, I think that within the current UK government, and by the way also the previous Conservative administration, there was a very high level of consciousness of the importance of the Baltic states. I think John Healey, as Defence Secretary, completely understands that. He's many times spoken in support of the JEF. He has many times visited the region. There's no doubt whatsoever that he is strongly committed himself and his ministry to that role. I think it is also the case, and I'm not speaking for him, I don't know him. I think that, but I can see from his recent appearances that he's also deeply frustrated and unhappy man because he's not been given the resources to fulfill that mission. But I think that is largely the result of the lack of resources. I don't think it's a result of a lack of knowledge or hostility. Now, when you come to the wider public, I think there one can say that there's a lot of benevolence towards the Baltic Sea region. And there's now certainly more knowledge than there was, let us say, 10 years ago. But I think there's not nearly enough consciousness of what is happening here and why it matters to the UK, which is one of the reasons why at the Centre of Geopolitics in Cambridge, which I'm the director of, and we have a Baltic geopolitics programme led by Charles Clarke, the former Home Secretary, we are so committed to increasing understanding of the Baltic Sea region, not merely as a favour to the region, but actually as a favour to ourselves. And it's also the reason why we are trying to build our research bench, and indeed, if possible, to try and achieve a professorship or lectureship in Lithuanian history or Lithuanian security, and indeed in those subjects for other Baltic Sea countries. I think that is necessary to underpin understanding of the commitment to the Baltic Sea region among the wider British public.
That would be a very meaningful and strong end point to our conversation. But I have a last question. And this last question, I think, is the less favorable from historians because it's a what-if question.
Yes.
So anyway, if future historians, when they will write about 20s, about this decade, what do you think they will identify as the defining strategic mistake or breakthrough? What it would be?
I think the decisive mistake was the failure in 2014 to take much more decisive and perhaps even radical action with the annexation of Crimea. I understand why European and Western powers were reticent, because they feared, after all, it was the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War in 1914.
Exactly. Yeah.
They feared that Crimea would be the new Sarajevo, and they feared we would be plunged into a destructive European war. They thought that Russian aims were much more limited, and they lacked confidence, I think, also in their own ability. And they were still very much within this narratival arc of a globalizing world, and they didn't really get their heads around what was happening. And so I think there was an opportunity in 2014 to take advantage of Putin's hesitation. I mean, after all, the first people to appear were the little green men. They were not identified as Russian soldiers because he did not know how we would react. And I think had we reacted more decisively, then I think we would be in a different place now. I think on the positive side, the really decisive thing is the ability of Ukraine to defend itself. Nobody predicted that on our side.
Exactly.
Very few, perhaps with the exception of people like my colleague, the military historian, Phillips O'Brien, and a few others. But the so-called smart money was arguing essentially that Russia would roll over Ukraine. That didn't happen. And I think that really was a moment in European history where things did not turn for even worse. We could envisage a situation now where, 4 years on from 2022, that Putin had simply captured all of Ukraine in a few weeks and was now sitting menacing, Romania, Poland and the Baltic states, and probably by that stage really rendering the Baltic states almost uninhabitable or uninvestable in, because he wouldn't even have to do anything, just the threat would be there. And I think the ability of the Ukrainians to turn that round has been the most remarkable and inspiring thing I have ever seen. I think it's almost a privilege, and easy to say from the safety of a Cambridge professorial office, but it's been the most inspiring thing I've seen, and it's been a privilege, at least to watch from the sidelines, to see the way in which a nation has managed to survive against such incredible odds.
Thank you. Thank you for your time and your conversation.
Thank you very much.